Remember there are 5 elements of transformation? Transformation of consciousness, a shift in lenses, okay, or a different way of looking at things, experimentation and learning, conversion, reconciliation, transformation of consciousness, and transformative visioning. So what we're going to do is take out this one element, transformative visioning, because this really is the engine of all this work. In other words, it sort of is the mapping process to figure out how you shape a vision for the future. So we'll add this layer to the voluminous material you got yesterday, and then we'll spend the afternoon processing this. And I know, Raymond, that this is, and others of you, this is overwhelming. It's a lot of stuff. But I think what we're trying to do these 2 days is just throw it all out here, okay, and then try to assimilate, make sense, and begin to work with it. Because if we did it piecemeal without knowing the rest of the pieces, it would be, I think, worse. So,
I brought a big
huh?
I brought a big pen kosher.
Okay, great. Your new metaphor for transformation. Okay, I'd like to start with this quote by Neil Walsh. And he says this: "Yearning for a new way will not produce it. Only ending the old way can do that. You cannot hold on to the old, all the while declaring that you want something new. The old will defy the new. The old will deny the new. The old will decry the new. There is only one way to bring in the new. You must make room for it." It's a powerful, pointed statement that I think is so real, because I hear a lot of yearnings with groups that I meet, and a lot of rhetoric. People certainly want it. I mean, if you say to someone, do you want to choose life or not? They say, well, of course I want to choose life. Okay? Everybody has that yearning, okay? But following through with what do you need to let go of, what do you need to let die in order to make room for that is a whole nother hurdle to cross. So, I think the big question that I'm putting in front of you today is what might be the transformative potential for you if you take this journey together as partners in shaping a new vision for the future. What might it hold for you? Do you want to do that? I think, John, you raised the question of discernment. I really believe these are discerning questions. And while we're engaging them now, hopefully over time there's a process that encourages more in-depth discernment. In an ongoing way, in a looping kind of way, keep coming back to these questions. Where are we now? Do we really want to do this? Is this really what God is calling us to? Etc. But that's the question I'd like to put before you today. Just want to recall for you this notion of the life cycle. And Mirko talked about these different life cycles that have taken place, on average around 250 to 300 years per life cycle for the religious life form, starting with the foundational phase and so forth. Through each phase, by the way, there are remnants that still exist for these prior phases. They don't entirely get sort of wiped out. I think someone talked about there was a meeting of the virgins of something in Philadelphia that had like 5,000 people. So there's still numbers in each of these vestiges of past life cycles. But the question is, what is the radical response to the gospel now, at this liminal phase in the religious life form that is going through a transformation? What is the next step? Where is it going? And let me just recall for you these sort of steps in this is generic, okay, but groups, organizations, and religious communities all go through these kind of phases. A foundational phase, happy Foundation Day, where your founder has the spirit, has a passion, and eventually in some way is inspiriting and empowering and drawing other people into that same passion and vision for the future. It's a very chaotic place to be, and oftentimes that's where groups fall down. They never just quite get off the ground. I think that since 1960-something, there have been 140 some odd new communities that have tried to give birth. They're all very small, and not many of them have continued on since then. So it's a very risky phase, as each one is going through each phase. This is the phase of experimentation and growth. where there's a rapid accumulation. The big challenge or crisis in moving to this phase is founder syndrome. You familiar with that term? Founder syndrome is, well, let's say you started a school, and you were there, you started it, it was your baby, you know, and people get attached to their babies. And the challenge is, how do you move from my baby to an organization where it is ours? And I'm sure you've had instances and people that have stayed a little bit too long. And the risk is it never becomes an organization. So each one of these stages has crisis and opportunity associated with it, and a different way of needing leadership at each of these stages, and a different way of needing the partnership with members. At this stage of the game, a organization becomes more stable, more routinized. They want to get rid of the chaos and the craziness, and they're trying to create a system that can function with a little more stability. Of course, the more you put structure and stability into place, that has an inverse relationship with spirit. So while there's great high spirit here, the spirit can begin to dwindle when you've overlaid all this structure and organizational. It becomes a stasis. I was with one group, and we'd had a couple glasses of wine, but I said, you know, if you really want to change things, blow up the mother house. Because that's the strongest stasis. It's literally in the brick and mortar. There's so much of embedded, entrenched norms there. Very, very difficult to change. So get rid of the building and try to start over. That could be too radical, but anyway. So at this stage in the life cycle, you've got options, choices to make. Do you refound? That's Arbuckle's term. Do you take a small segment of your community and try to fire up those embers and let them start in a new way and support them to do their thing, radically different than perhaps the nature of community that you're used to? So that's one possibility. Reconfiguring. In the 1990s, there were a lot of mergers and unions and restructurings of congregations coming back to one unit. And the difficulty and the problem with that is, while it's an effort to solve some of the diminishing resources, you've got the same demographic, and it ends up with a big gerontocracy, is how I would call it. Just a larger group of older men or older women still trying to handle the same amount of stuff. And so it may fix your finance office or some of your specific kinds of things administratively, but now you've got this huge thing that you've got to figure out what to do with really the same proportion of resources, personnel resources, to work with it. So reconfiguring is one thing, and again, the big challenge here is, when you do that process of merger or reconfiguring, are you doing the inner work? Because you can rearrange the structures all day long, but you bring your patterns with you, you bring your structures, your mindsets, and everything else, and that's been part of the dilemma. So there's not as many mergers going on these days as there were 20 years ago. Restructuring is what a lot of groups have done as well, changing the organizational structure of their units. So maybe they've formed a new model of leadership, a new way to do leadership. It's an effort to try to deal with life and organize life differently, given some of the crises that leaderships are facing. And there are many ways in which that have been done. The big emphasis has been recruitment, recruitment, recruitment. The prayer for new vocations has been a singular and primary focus for practically every community. Many communities just regress. They go back to old ways. Think about it when you've had a loss in your life, for instance. We regress. We go back and we revisit old losses, perhaps that we hadn't thought of or felt in a long time. It's an opportunity to integrate. Regression's not a bad thing, I would say, as a psychologist, if it's a round trip. In other words, if you come back, if you do the integration, that's afforded that opportunity in the regression experience. But a lot of groups are going back, as you know, to tried and true ways. I know you've probably heard of the Dominicans in, Wisconsin, that are getting lots of vocations. They've been on Oprah Winfrey, but they're back in the habit and doing a lot of the traditional horariums and so forth. So, like I said before, there'll be many remnants of what has been, even into the future. But that's not the large wave that is happening. Some groups are choosing to die with dignity. And I want to just legitimate that. There are some groups that are simply too old. I was with one group in Wisconsin, and they were a smaller group, and this was a women's community. There were about, I don't know, 40 members, something like that. And they were looking at merger as a possibility. Their average age was 80. And I remember sitting in the room, we were visiting each one of the sisters, and I was sitting in this one sister's room. She joined religious community when she was 12. She was 90. She lived in that same room all of her life, all of her religious life. So 78 years, whatever. She had an angel for every year that she'd been in the community. They were everywhere in the room. So I'm sitting down saying, well, what do you think about this merger idea? And we're trying, and me, in my own head, I'm going, this is just nuts. This is crazy. It would be like trying to transplant a 100-year-old oak tree to a new place. It would die. She would die. And they do die when you do that kind of thing. So through quite a discernment process, collectively and individually, they chose to die out. And it doesn't mean it's not a matter of throwing in the towel and giving up and dying out. It's a matter of living out your days well. That's what our parents did, right? Okay, so what do we do to live out our days well? There were 4 or 5 sisters, however, the younger sisters, who chose to join another community. Made perfect sense. But it wasn't a divorce. It wasn't a split. It wasn't done out of anger. It was done out of discernment. And it made good sense for those individuals to move elsewhere and for the rest of them to live out their days well. And they figured out what resources they need to do that. I think for a lot of groups, when they've reached a certain point, that can be a really, really healthy choice. The tragic choice is, the throwing in the towel, dying before you're dead, or not really making a choice, or thinking you're making a choice to transform, but you're doing all those things that I said yesterday, where the dirty dozen, you're guaranteed that you're going to die, but they believe that they're transforming. So that's the tragedy that I kind of see. But this dying with dignity piece, I think, is really important as part of your discernment, And none of these are black and white. You either do this or you do that. They're all connected. And so what is the path that you need to take? That's the question. Do you want to search for this road of transformation, and how does that involve these other things? Those make sense to you? Okay. So we talk about that crossroads, and what I said to you yesterday, the challenge is to change. What got you to today won't get you to tomorrow. A bend in the road is not an end in the road unless you fail to make the turn, and it's essential that you adapt, and most groups don't. Most groups don't, because it's so hard to do. So the invitation at a deeper level is to do this discernment that John was referring to and others of you are speaking to. It really is about looking deep into your own heart and your own prayers with detachment from the outcome and interior freedom, to use Ignatian discernment pillars, to really look at where are you being called? What does new life even mean to you? And what's the path toward that direction? So that's where we were yesterday, and will you be among the most courageous and innovative communities to give birth to new life? That is the big question. So those are the 5 elements, and what I want to talk about this morning is this element of transformative visioning, this way of shaping a future together, and to give you a template for what that could look like, and then we'll be wrestling and working through that template to see what makes sense for you, if any of it does. First of all, why choose transformative visioning as approach, this kind of methodology? What I said yesterday, I think that the data is pretty clear. Conventional approaches don't transform. That's one of the big reasons. So if you're not going to do one of those, if not that, then what? Then what? So what's the alternative? Okay? I also believe that globally, there is a call for greater interdependence. I really believe Pope Francis is, blowing that clarion call into our spaces. We really are being called to live more interdependently. It is the movement, since Teilhard de Chardin has talked about that. We've had the United Nations. There's so many indications that we can't live in silos and tribes anymore. We can't stay there. To put it in your terms, we can't just have our own story. How do we collectively create a narrative that calls us toward greater interdependence? And how do you as a congregation celebrate the gifts? And I'm not talking pie in the sky, okay? But you have a lot of gifts. You have spiritual riches. You have material resources. You have personnel resources. You have much to put at the table. The question is, can you grapple with the truth of what that is and celebrate the truth of what that is and build from there, rather than create some kind of house of cards out of fluff, or, you know, what is really real or honest or truthful? But I think if you can get to the truth, you'll find an abundance. How did Viktor Frankl, you're all familiar with Viktor Frankl, who was in Auschwitz during World War II. How did that man, who was literally in that concentration camp, come to realize the abundance of life and the meaning and purpose of life? I mean, if he can do it, you know, can't we do this? Can't we find a way to celebrate who we are, even with the limitations that you might have? So why this approach also to care for the soul of community? You know, some of you have talked about some of your men who are just living out their days and want to be left alone. And maybe so, maybe that's what they'll choose. And that is what a lot of communities do end up choose. They just find their comfortable space and leave me alone. Let me live out my days. Well, I think this call, this approach, this transformative visioning, this journey is about, can you wake up and look at the soul of who you are collectively in that and address the whole of you. You know, you've named that in your chapter statements. Let's claim the oneness we are, the internationality that we have, and find a way to collectively look at what the future holds for us. And I believe this kind of approach taps into that. And it's all about deepening your faith journey and to enliven your mission and charism. And I say for the future generations in parentheses, because only God knows whether your charism and mission will serve the world in the future. It's your job to do the best you can to make it as real and as rich as you can. But it really, God's going to determine ultimately whether that carries forward or not. So to put it, to draw the distinctions here, I've sort of named 3 kinds of visioning processes. And you could think of some of your chapters as a way to sort of tap into this. Restorative processes, directional visioning processes, or transformative. The restorative and directional kinds of processes have the mindset of a certain goal. We've got to get to a certain place, you know, so in 6 years we will have accomplished this. We're focused on the destination. We are goal-oriented. For those of you who are J's on the Myers-Briggs, this is an appealing place to be, okay? The transformative process is more about what is your destiny. It's less about what you accomplish in terms of like opening a new ministry, for example, and much more about the sort of people you're becoming. That's really the thrust and emphasis. Doesn't mean the others don't matter, okay? These are all a matter of emphasis. It's not as black and white as the table. But this kind of approach is much more about the sort of people you're becoming rather than the kinds of new projects you might initiate. Restorative efforts of visioning sort of are trying to restore what was. A lot of groups might sort of decide to fix up their mother house or fix up their constitutions. Let's redo our constitutions. They're trying to put back some of the things that have gotten out of whack and out of place and restore it. Reform has more to do with the new improved version of that. And in this process, in a transformative process, you're really looking at goals that will enable and offer the possibility of transformation among yourselves as a group. Restorative processes are more about compliance and cooperation than collaboration. There are more problem solving, etc. So I hope you can get some of these distinctions. It's kind of a key thing in the orientation. I think this last one here is also important. The official future. You know, I gave you the statistics Okay, that's the official future. There'll be X number. It'll probably look like this. There are a lot of people sort of trying to paint a picture of what religious life will look like 10, 20 years out. And it's pretty reasonable, and it makes a lot of sense. It's logical, what people are saying. There'll be smaller communities. There'll be more collaborative communities. All these are trends that we're hearing. Makes more sense. But I think in this kind of process, what you might be invited to do is to look at multiple scenarios for the future. There's a process called scenario planning that does just that. They use that in South Africa to deal with apartheid. What are the multiple ways of the future that could unfold? Because in fact, if you pick out one future, rarely is that the picture, okay? And it's not like we're trying to prognosticate here. We're trying to look, what we're really trying to do in looking at multiple futures is to loosen up your minds and to begin to imagine and get outside the box. It's not trying to pin the right one down. It's really to get you into imagining different possibilities as you go forth. There are three keys to this that I think are really important, and they are depth, integration, and partnership. The depth piece, what I spoke to yesterday is, okay, we got to get beyond, you have to deal with buildings and finances and ministries and all the practicalities of your life, all the visible things that you see. However, you know, the trap in like restructuring is people restructure, but they don't do the inner work. So what's the inner work that you need to do? This is depth work. Look how much time, you spend a half an hour in prayer. It's not a lot of time, but it's more time than some people spend. You know, you're spending 3 days here. It's not a lot of time, but it's more time than some people spend. And with groups that I'm working with that are in a more concentrated area, we meet collectively 3 times a year for 4 or 5 days. FaceTime. FaceTime is essential. Technology can help with some things. It can share information, you can do some logistical planning, problem solving, things like that. But for you to get to the depth of your lives, you need time and space to do that. You need FaceTime. So depth is really critical if you're going to want to really wrestle with these kinds of things, structures, mental models, the soul of who you are. And in this process, you got to hit all 3 areas here. There needs to be personal work that people do. There needs to be communal work that people do. There's a real scary thought. And there needs to be systemic work. If you do one without the other, we're missing a critical piece. You can't just do this depth work if you're not doing the personal work along the way. And you can't just do the systemic work if you're not really addressing what's happening in your communities. And the communal work, I really believe, is the most difficult in terms of the entrenched patterns and resistance that you will find in communities. Does that match your experience?
Yes.
Yeah. Not saying anything new there? Okay. So depth is key. How do you create a process that invites depth and helps you go deeper than just the surface of your lives? That's one key piece. The second key piece is integration. How do you connect the strategic planning kind of stuff, goals and plans that you've got to make, you've got to budget, you've got to figure that stuff out. And how do you connect that to these other elements of transformation? How do you connect whatever your plans are to the work of conversion? How do you connect whatever your plans are to really a shift in mindset? How can you come about that? So at different times you're trying to hit different aspects of this. You don't always do everything all at once. But how do you integrate and hold on to the integrative picture? So how do you integrate what's happening in Africa with what's happening here in the United States? How can you take those two sides of the life cycle and see them as complementary and potentially mutually beneficial rather than create two different separate processes for those two different worlds? So all that kind of stuff, the integration piece is key. Otherwise, it's like, for example, you have a meeting, you have another meeting 3 months from now, you have another meeting 6 months from now, and they're each sort of individual isolated moments. How do you build the continuity and the integration from one experience to the next so that you are building something rather than just having isolated experiences or living in silos? So we'll get to that when I get to the structures here. And partnership is the third piece that I think is so essential. Leadership can't do this on their own. And I really believe your congregation as a whole can't do this on your own. So the opening up of boundaries and the collaborative partnerships that you shape among yourselves and with others outside your congregation, I think is a really key piece. Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. Leverage. Leverage. I think partnership is a key leverage piece for whatever direction you go in. So those are the three key pieces as I would name them. So what I want to talk about, and we'll probably take another break right about here, is process, content, your involvement in this, and a possible timeline or a notion of a timeline, a very loosey-goosey kind of timeline. Okay, so let's talk about the process of transformative visioning. Again, this piece needs to connect to these other pieces. So all along the way while you're doing a visioning process, hopefully you're touching into the other dynamics of transformation at different points with different accentuations of that, but they need to be a part of it. It's just not visioning as such. So for me, it has these sort of phases, if you could call them that very loosely. For me, they're more overlapping and intertwining, but generally speaking, it starts with sort of an awakening kind of process, then grounding into who you really are and what is your world saying to you, and dreaming out possibilities and discerning those possibilities and then realizing those possibilities. The example I just gave of, a letter that people might write, your deepest longings, obviously that's a dreaming exercise, but it's something I find helpful in the very beginning process as well. So these are somewhat of the phases, if you want to call them that. A basic definition, transformative visioning for me, it's a multi-phase, collaborative process of envisioning a future distinct from the past. Not a new improved version, not an extension of the past, but a leap into something significantly distinct from the past. So it's multi-phase process, and it's a collaborative process working together at this, and it's to shape a future together distinct from the past. So what's this awakening phase? Thomas Merton once said, we must learn to fall in love with the truth. I love that. And I think most people have a love-hate relationship with the truth. We like certain truths, we don't like other truths, and we're damned if we want to see them or embrace them. But I think ultimately, if you can, there's liberation in that. The truth will set you free if you let it. If you let it. So getting through some of the denial is really important, what I call denial busting and reality testing. I mean, when I just said to you your numbers, 12 years from now, that's a little piece of reality. I'm sure you've heard them before, but each time it's a little chipping away at denial kind of thing. So the reality testing, the denial busting is important, but it's also about enthusing your congregation, inspiring them and bringing hope to them. It's all this kind of stuff, and a sense of urgency. This process, should you choose to go here, needs to be a sustained priority process for your congregation. It can't be an add-on. Add this to your schedules as they already are. So something's got to give. That's another part of we'll get to tomorrow. Like, do you really want to do this? And if you do, what's got to give? Because everybody's calendar is full, if not over full. So finding a sense of urgency, making this a priority where you're collectively, as a congregation, doing this kind of work together is critical. And continuing to understand this as a journey of faith. I bring in a lot of organizational stuff, but you heard, I think, pieces from me so far that I'm a spiritual person on my own path as well. It can't be just a heady, cerebral, organizational task. It needs to be connected to the core of your spiritual path as a congregation. That's critical. But it can't be just that. There are a lot of communities that have in the past got into a lot of they've over-spiritualized the effort, and it became a lot of fluff. A lot of spiritual conversation, but it wasn't connected to any concrete, didn't have any teeth to it. And then people get sick of it and tired of it, and they get demoralized. So when you do things that don't work, it reinforces people's cynicism, and they say, oh, forget it. Been there, done that, we ain't doing nothing. So they get very cynical. So the awakening phase is an ongoing thing. You know, you're working at this now. Continue to try to strengthen the sense of what are you doing? Why are you doing it? What's the importance of this, etc. Getting the all-important commitment. Mother Teresa talks about the importance of having just a conversation with God. The grounding piece. If you're going to create a vision for the future, you need to be grounded in who you are, really who you are. Not just demographically, but all across the board. What is your identity? I'm sure you have it written down somewhere. But honestly, what is it today? How do you live it? How do you experience it? We talked about yesterday, that gap between who you say you are and how you actually live. What's going on there? What's that about? And every group has that. So what's that say to you? So if you're going to create a vision of the future, you need to do more than just a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Okay, that's what SWOT stands for, if you're not familiar with that. And that's the typical beginning approach, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's got to be more than that, okay? So this deep work, understanding who you really are as a group and embracing that fully, as well as what you see in the world, the context around you, what's happening in the church, what's happening in religious life, what's happening with the people that you hope to serve, what are the trends that you're seeing. So putting yourself together with the world is an important part of this process. Okay, well, Martin Luther King had a dream. And I think the dream aspect of this is important. It can't just stay a dream, can't be all fluff. But it's really important that people are tapping into your deepest longings, your greatest aspirations. What really do you hope for and long for in your future, 10 years out, personally, collectively? What really is that about? So it can't be a cerebral exercise. It really needs to be born out of the heart and soul of who you are, and to look at those possibilities and to unearth those possibilities together. That's the exciting part, and there needs to be excitement and hope and enthusiasm and imagination. So what I talked about yesterday, the notion of stretch goals. You need goals that are going to really stretch you, lure you, and so forth, and you also need to know, well, what do we do tomorrow? To begin to mobilize that. But this is speaking to the stretch goals, those big longings that you might have. And discerning. The truth shall set you free if you let it. So all along the way, I don't think you need to have like one great big discernment day to discern, 3 options per se. Maybe you do that on a certain leg of the conversation. But all along the way to be touching into, where is God calling you? What's making sense? And I think that takes place at every level. In the planning group, because it's not just sitting there and doing quick planning. Hopefully you're dialoguing with one another, praying with one another, searching out together. Where is the lure and love of God calling us now, given what we know today? Okay, you take a next step and you're asking that same question all along the way. So the personal and communal aspect of this, of discernment, I think is a really critical piece. And obviously, this is Steve Jobs, his phrase down there, dreams without action are hallucinations. He is a plain speaking guy, and he wants to see these dreams become reality. And I think that's so important. It has to become real. You have to get real. And the tension between reality and aspirations, the reality in your stretch goals, is a tension you need to learn to live with and hold. So how do groups hold together? Well, this is our reality. We can't do that. This is our reality. And how do we hold together that with the longing? And how do you keep working with those tensions together? So ultimately, though, you need these things like goals and objectives and timelines and budgets, because you can't move without those. At the same time, you got to hold the big dream in place. But to take action. I think it was Sandra Snyder's, who's written a lot on the future of religious life, talks a lot about it. She wrote a book with some partners called Common Ground. It's about yay thick, if you want to read it. But I think it's about 10 years old now. At the very end of the book, you can hear her exasperation in the comments. She said, just do something. Just do something. In other words, you've got to act. Act your way into a new way of being. The paralysis by analysis is really a problem for religious communities. So yeah, you want to pray, discern, analyze, do all that, but you've got to take a step. Take a step and see what that brings you. So those are the 5 phases, so to speak. Let me talk about content. So what are you going to talk about? What are you going to work with? Well, I'll back that up a bit. You had your chapter material, and you have other core documents that you have spent time with to develop, to get a sense of who you are, what you're about, and where you're going. So the content doesn't come from me. I can give you process, but the content, what you talk about, and what you work with, the clay of this visioning process, comes from you. And the way I've started to help groups do this is to help groups think about carving up their life, all of your life, into sort of 3 canisters, categories, or lenses. I like to think of them as lenses. Community, okay, how do you live and organize your life? What's that need to look like 10 years out? Your mission, 10 years out, what is that going to be for you? What do you hope it will be for you? What will the mission aspect of your congregation look like? And your stewardship of resources, human, financial, spiritual, material resources. What does that look like? How do you need to align those in support of what you're shaping in your community and in your mission? So those big, broad categories of content, and all of that is yours to develop. So let me flesh it out just a little bit. In the mission category of things, 10 years out, what do you imagine that needs to be? What are the critical questions you need to ask yourself? What's the agenda? And we're going to be working with this afternoon, by the way. What's the agenda that you need to develop with regard to your mission that will help you shape a vision for the future? Can you reimagine the possibilities other than what you're just seeing right now today, 10 years out? What does that need to look like? I like to use the phrase upsize. Most groups think about downsizing or right-sizing. I'm sure you've done some of that, okay? Smaller numbers, you need less buildings if you're going to have proper utilization, etc. Some groups say, we're smaller in number, we need a smaller leadership team. I don't always agree with that, but that's the logic around downsizing and right-sizing. I like to challenge that and say, can you think about 10 years from now upsizing your mission? And the way I think about that is because, you know what, you have associates, you have partners in mission, people you co-minister with, other people who resonate with your the charism that you resonate with, okay? They hold the same values, they are loyal to you, they love you. How long has Eric and Tony been with you?
50 years.
15 years, okay? These people that you've come to associate with are, in organizational terms, your warm market. They care about you, and they know you, and they're loyal to you, and they love you, and they resonate with so much of your life. Holy mackerel. Can you invite them into this process? If you can, potentially you can upsize your mission rather than thinking, this inevitably shrinking down of who you are kind of thing. So think upsizing rather than downsizing. And think of what kind of partners you might need 10 years from now. Maybe the core group of partnerships that you have now, maybe that isn't where you're going in 10 years. Maybe you begin to think of, really it's these people over here that are more aligned with where we think we're going. And maybe we think about letting go of these people here. Maybe those are sponsored ministries. Maybe those are associates. I don't know. But are they your future? Who is your future? And how are they aligned with you? So that's the mission piece. There's just a ton of stuff there. It's a big chunk of your life. Community. 10 years from now, what do you want community to look like? What does it look like now? How's it working for you? How do you need to organize your life? Who do you need to be living with? What does that need to look like? How do you need to meet and make decisions together, et cetera, et cetera. This is a huge chunk of your life, basically how you live and organize your life, make decisions, and work together. So 10 years from now, what will you be witnessing to this world? By the way in which you live, the sort of people you become. What do you want that to look like? Where is your sense of belonging? Where is your sense of home? Those are basic on Maslow's needs hierarchy. Okay, once you get shelter and food, we need these things. A place of home, a place of belonging. Do you find that in community? Or are you finding that outside of community? What I find in a lot of groups, that they've been burnt, hurt, whatever in community, been there, done that, don't want to do that anymore. But we're all going to thirst to grow. We all need these things met, a place of home. And so what individuals and communities do, they find another green space to grow in, fortunately. You know, maybe that's the new ministry opportunity. Nobody knows them. They start fresh, no reputations there, and they find themselves growing again. And that's great. Or maybe they go into spiritual direction or counseling. That's great. Can you create green space here? Can you reclaim the life that you can have, want to have as a community? Can you create a sense of home here, a sense of belonging here that's real, and not live parallel lives? Those are questions. So what does community need to look like 10 years from now? What's the culture you want to create? Stewardship. Most people think of stewardship in terms of finances. I want to broaden that for you. You have more resources than just finances. You have your spiritual resources, you have personnel resources, you have material resources, buildings, land, etc. And the most important and precious resource, obviously, is yourselves. So how are you aligning those into the future? What does that need to look like 10 years out? How are you going to handle your healthcare situations? How are you going to address your utilization of property and land? And where do you want to be in terms of your own sense of generativity at this stage, at least for the U.S. group, that whole sense that is part of our developmental movement as human beings, to the desire to give back. I think our average age, I said for men right now it's about life expectancy around 80, just bordering on that. At the turn of the century, the last century, it was 40 years less. We've been given 40 extra years. What are you going to do with that? Is there a reason for that? You know? Ronald Rolheiser wrote a book, I keep missing the title, something about fire. Anybody remember it? Something like that. And Joan Chittister's written a lot about this as well. We have this developmental need at this stage of the game to give to others, to give back. We're thinking more about legacy than we are sometimes about our own personal future. So what is your sense of that? 10 years from now, how are you going to be addressing that felt emotional need in your lives to give your lives for a good reason and a good cause? Beyond mission per se, but what's that about for you? So generativity, sustainability, alignment, what is your next best evolutionary step as a congregation? Those are three big chunks of your life: stewardship, mission, and community. In addition to that, okay, that's the grounding piece, who you are, mission, community, stewardship. Beyond that also is your context, to understand that. What are you seeing as trends with regard to the world in which you live? And there's tons of information out there, lots of information about trends. And there's lots more you can do with processing that other than just get the data and study it. For example, one group, we did this as a beginning of a large visioning process. They invited a lot of additional outsiders in. So there was about 150 people. But 2 months ahead of that assembly, we had them simply read the news, or listen to the news, or go on the internet, whatever they do to tap their own appreciation of the world, and start logging what's standing out for them, what's touching them, what's evoking whatever in them. And we brought those to the assembly and began to talk about what's getting stirred as a result of what people are hearing. So it's one thing to do the study of it, which is important, but it's another thing to begin to say, well, what difference is that making, any of this to you? Because it can't be, transformation is not a conceptual thing, it's a visceral thing. It needs to tap really what's happening in you. So the context is another piece. Where do you think things are going 10 years from now? Where do you hope to tap into your world 10 years from now? What kind of partnerships do you want? And I said this, I sort of jumped ahead and emphasized this before. Who are the partners that you want to engage more fully 10 years from now? And who are the partners in your life that potentially you might want to say, these are less essential to our future? And if that's the case, how do you responsibly sort of loosen those ties? Maybe that's succession planning of certain ministries, the assistance in their creating a legacy, whatever, but you need to sort of begin to let go of those folks that you don't believe hold the primary place in your future. And let me stop there just to get some, I know I'm throwing out a lot of stuff. So those are 3 big pieces of the pie here.